They are vivid, sometimes chilling descriptions of the lives of German soldiers during World War II, all brought to life in secretly recorded transcripts of German POWs. And joining us now to tell us more about what those transcripts reveal, Sonke Neitzel. He is a historian and co-author of Soldaten, on fighting, killing, and dying, the secret World War II transcripts of German POWs. Willkommen and guten Abend.
Yeah, good evening.
Nice to have you here. Let's tell the story here. In 2001, you paid a visit to the British National Archives. What were you looking for?
Well, at this time I was intending to write a book on the German Navy, and I was looking for new sources on the mentality of German sailors, because we had all these classical sources, war diaries, memoirs, and so on, and I was trying to go beyond that and want to understand the mentality of German sailors, German Navy personnel. And at this time I came across a book from Michael Gannon, American historian. He has written a book on the Battle of the Atlantic, Black May, and in this book he has published a few pages on bugging reports of German prisoners of war. And I was really astonished about that, but I never heard about bugging reports. I knew that there were interrogation reports.
Bugging as in eavesdropping, as in secretly tape recording?
So really the conversation, line by line, you could follow the conversation. So I was interested in that because it's obviously a new kind of source. So I was in Glasgow this time, and so I flew down to London. And then I found this amazing treasure of tens of thousands of pages of bugging reports from German prisoners of war, even some thousands of Italian prisoners of war, recorded during the war in secret camps.
And before you actually started reading the transcripts, what did you expect to find in them?
To be honest, I just expected a few pages, a tiny little folder of probably one conversation, two conversations, but not a huge operation starting in the very beginning of the war and ending in October 45. So I was very relaxed, and I said, well, okay, I'm following that path, but I won't find anything really important. But then I was there in London on that nasty November day in 2001, and I was sitting on my desk, on my green desk, and I ordered some folders, and they came, and it was very big, 700 pages each, just covering 1 month, just sailors, just Navy personnel. So I thought, well, this is the tip of an iceberg, there must be some more.
Did the people who were being bugged know they were being secretly recorded?
No. I think I can prove in the book that they were not knowing this. I mean, obviously there were 14,000 German prisoners bugged, so we can't prove that every single German soldier didn't expect that. But we have clear evidence from their personal diaries that they sometimes reported also in letters at home that they were not expecting that. Also because the British were very cunning in organizing that. And so sometimes they interrogated them. They put them back into a prisoner cell, and then the Germans said, you know, the interrogation officer asked me these silly questions, and I lied. And then he's telling his fellow soldier in the cell what was true. So again, they didn't expect that, and especially, I mean, you must imagine that even days after they were captured, they were bugged, and their will to share their experience. And sometimes the circumstances of their capture were dramatic. They were shot down on planes, they were sunk in their submarines. And if you put two sailors, two pilots together, they were obviously immediately starting sharing their war experience.
The reason I ask, of course, is because, you know, if you know you are being bugged, you might change your story.
But still, I think the wish of human beings to talk and to exchange their views is so strong. I mean, put two journalists together and say, you can talk on every subject, but not on journalism. It might take an hour or so, and then they start again talking on their field of interest, on their work. So, and the British, again, they were very cunning. For example, they put an engineer from a battleship and an engineer from a U-boat together. And obviously, these two engineers, you have diesel engine, and you have different engines. And then they talked about these engines, and then discovered that they have different experiences, and then they talked about the war in general, the Nazi ideology, and other subjects.
We're going to get to that. You use the term in the book, a frame of reference, to explain the actions of German soldiers at this time. What did you mean by that?
Well, frame of reference is somehow a belief system, a system which we refer to, and we all have these systems. And you as a journalist have a special system on how do you behave as a journalist, what do you do, what is a good journalist, what is a bad journalist. I as a scholar have also these kind of a belief system. And also soldiers do have these systems, and they give them orientation in their everyday life. What are they expected to do? What is good, what is bad? And the German soldiers had also a belief system, a frame of reference, what they should do and what they should not do, how they should behave. And even you must imagine that ordinary people were drafted into the Wehrmacht. 17 million Germans served in the Wehrmacht. And only a minority of them were professional soldiers. So they were drafted, they were bus drivers,
regular
shop holders.
people.
Yeah, regular people. But then they came into the army, and they must have a reorientation. So what do they expect from me to do? I have a steel helmet on, I'm wearing a uniform, and so they're coming in a new world, and they very quickly adopted that value system of the Wehrmacht. And also, I mean, we use that frame to explain, or that phrase to explain the reference which you have in war times is different than in peace times, because fighting, killing is demanded in wars, and obviously not on peacetime.
Right.
And so they very quickly adopted to that. And they very quickly, this is the interesting thing, if you read these stories, it's very, very astonishing how brutality, how mass violence, how atrocities is just very normal for them. And for us, it's very annoying, very disgusting, very shocking.
But for them, it was a typical conversation.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I mean, obviously went through the book, and I want to just pluck a typical conversation out here, and I want to read an excerpt from the book. So here are two German soldiers, bugged, having a conversation. Here's Müller. When I was at Kharkiv, the whole place had been destroyed except the center of the town. It was a delightful town, a delightful memory. Everyone spoke a little German. They'd learnt it at school. At Taganrog, too, there were splendid cinemas and wonderful cafes on the beach. We did a lot of flying near the junction of the Don and the Dönitz. It's a beautiful country. I traveled everywhere in a lorry. Everywhere we saw women doing compulsory labor service. The other man, Faust, how frightful. Müller again. They were employed on road making, extraordinarily lovely girls. We drove past, simply pulled them into the armored car, raped them, and threw them out again. And did they curse? He just sort of, right, in conversation, points out that, yeah, we raped them and on we go. What did that conversation tell you?
I mean, obviously there were two young men talking to each other. So there is an element of masculinity, an element of, look, I'm a really good man, and we had the power of raping women, and I'm have this sexual energy. The interesting thing is that the other guy didn't complain about that. The other guy, the reaction of the other guy is not, I mean, you're a war criminal, you can't do this. So for the other guy, he accepted that.
It was all normal.
It was all normal. There was no astonishment about that. And that's quite interesting. So it tells you something about their frame of reference again. What is normal, what is unnormal. If he had said, we killed the women, then probably the reaction would have been different, because it was quite clear that if you were killing women and children, this was something different. But the raping...
But rape, they were entitled to.
Yeah.
Again, I want to come back to what I said earlier, though, which is, how do we know that you're not eavesdropping on a conversation of two men who are just simply boasting about things which really aren't true?
Yeah. We still do not know on every conversations like this conversation if this was really true. But to be a bit provocative, it doesn't matter to us. For us, it's important what do they express and what is able to express. I mean, and this is a clear regulations. You can tell your fellow soldiers something about raping. You can't tell your fellow soldiers something about I've killed children. Then the reaction would have been different. So there's a clear understanding of what you can do and what you can't do, and that's interesting because this frame is very different to our frame.
And this was typical?
And the raping was typical, yeah.
So this is...
The raping was typical, and also when there were a lot of prostitutes, and they're comparing even the prices and even their experiences of that, and even they integrate the raping into their conversations. I mean, we don't know if this raping story was really true, but the interesting thing is that they were able to express it.
Mm-hmm. It gives you some insight into their thinking.
Yeah.
The reference in here to Kharkiv, meaning they were in Ukraine.
Yeah.
meaning these soldiers were probably on the Eastern Front of World War II, which was horrendous, right? Just brutal. How much do you think they knew about the Nazi war machine against the Soviet Union, a war of total annihilation, all of that?
I mean, you could ask the question, how much do they know and how much are they aware that this was a war of annihilation? I think, obviously, the experience of the German soldiers serving on the Eastern Front, 10 million soldiers served on the Eastern Front, when they experienced that it was a very brutal war and so on and so on. Interestingly, they never used that phrase, war of annihilation. For us, it's quite clear, Second World War, especially Eastern Front, was a war of annihilation. But why didn't they use that phrase? Because it's interesting, like these two guys, for them, it was nice to be in the Ukraine. They had fun. They enjoyed themselves.
Enjoyed the cinemas.
Yeah, enjoyed the cinemas. Everybody speaks a little German. How nice it was. And for them, for their immediate social experience, it was not a war of annihilation. And even if they witnessed it, for example, mass executions, the reaction was, oh, it's awful. But they don't go further. They don't say, well, if we killing 10,000, hundreds of thousands of Jews, this must be a criminal regime. This must be a criminal institution, the Wehrmacht. I have to do something against it. No, they just exchange their experience and then they stop. And then they come back to gossip again, probably.
Here's another one I'm going to read now. This is also from your book, an excerpt from a conversation between two prisoners of war. His name is Bastian. Our racial policy is excellent. Also, the Jewish question and the entire legislation for preserving the purity of German blood. That law is really first class. How much of an influence do you think Nazism had on the typical
ordinary
grunt, we would call it in English, the grunt soldier, the average guy at the bottom of the totem pole?
Well, I think there was an influence, obviously, because these people are living in the society of the Third Reich. They were sharing, again, the frame of reference of that society, that, for example, Jews doesn't belong to the German people. But the book shows clearly that the idea of German soldiers being hardcore Nazi soldiers, ardent Nazis, is not really true. We estimated 5 to 10% of the German soldiers really had a clear understanding of Nazi ideology. The overwhelming majority, and 5 to 10% were massively anti-Nazi, Social Democrats, Communists, and so on. And the big majority were rather unpolitical. They had probably some pieces and bits, but they were not interested in policy.
Basically, guys just fighting.
Yeah, and they even don't use the interpretations of the Nazi ideology, of the Nazi propaganda. For example, if they're describing the Soviet people, they say the Russians. They don't say the Bolsheviks. But if you see the German newsreel, you never find the word Russians. It's always the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, the subhumans, but they don't use that.
Why not?
Because their experience is different. I mean, even the main importance for the German soldiers, what is their experience, their everyday experience? And they very soon regarded the Russian soldiers, the Soviet soldiers, as tough fighters, as brave fighters. They're fighting for their country.
So they respected them.
They feared them because there was probably a different culture of war there, but they feared them and they respected them. So they said, well, the Nazi propaganda is not true. They are not subhuman. We can learn from them. We can learn from them how to survive in this environment, how to fight in this area. So their social experience was quite important, and they're even somehow, to give you another example of how simple their political attitude was, they distinguished between Hitler and the Nazi regime. So they said, well, Hitler was quite positive until 1944, perceived, but the Nazi regime very soon rather negative. And how can they distinguish between these two? But this belongs together for obvious reasons. But for them, Hitler was not, as for us, the starting point of all that. For them, it was like a monarch, a president, the father of the fatherland. So everything good was projected into Hitler, and the negative things was a regime, which is weird, obviously.
Now, would that have been typical? You say that's typical of the lower-ranking grunt soldier. How about higher-ranking soldiers, generals, for example?
With the generals, it's very interesting because we in the recent years we discovered that how they acted quite similar on the front line, that they committed a lot of war crimes, that they had a lot of criminal orders and so on. So we thought it is an elite group of Nazi generals. But with these documents we can see they acted the same, but the perception of what they did was sometimes totally controversial. So we have really hardcore anti-Nazi generals who fought on the Eastern Front, who fought in the war and said, I'm going to hate Hitler, but they're still fighting. And then you can say, how is this? Because they regarded the fighting as such, as a value for itself. So there, even if they had a negative view on the regime, they said, well, yes, the regime might be negative, but if I'm doing my job, if I'm being a good soldier, then I can keep my honor.
Yes.
And they didn't realize, if I'm continue the fighting, I'm fighting for Hitler. I must stop the fighting. And this is, so they were kept in the frame of reference of a soldier. A soldier has to be brave. And this was the problematic thing for them. They can't leave that frame of being a tough soldier, of being a good soldier.
What did the transcripts say that you found of interest related to the end of the war? When the average German soldier found out the war was over and they had obviously lost, what did they have to say?
I mean, again, it's interesting that they continued the fighting already. They knew that the war was lost. And again, I come to the point that they want to be tough soldiers, they want to be good soldiers, and so they continued the fighting. And then, when they realized the war was over, some generals said, we must surrender. We must surrender. It's a crime to continue the fighting. But I mean, they were in captivity. So they could say this. They already had left some part of the frame. That's the problem. The other soldiers just continued the fighting, and they had almost no idea what was coming behind that. That some people said, well, it might be a communist Germany, a Russian occupation of Germany, but their political view of what was coming, the Cold War and so on, was very limited.
Do you think your book alters what I suspect is the conventional worldview, a negative view of German soldiers during World War II? Do you think this book helps create maybe more sympathy for them or alter that view?
Probably not. I wouldn't use the word sympathy, but still we have all the war crimes, we have the atrocities. But I think if we can achieve more an understanding, especially in the Anglo-American world, where sometimes probably it's even hard to distinguish between Germans and Nazis and all the things, I think it's even more too complicated. Or it's more complicated. And the interesting thing is that we must understand the banality of war, even from the Second World War. And if we read these transcripts, we can and we must ask ourselves, what has this to do with today? And in Germany nowadays, everybody says, well, these are Nazis, the bad Wehrmacht, and we are the Federal Republic of Germany, we have learned our lessons, this is totally different. And I don't think that we can argue like this. I think the similarities, given the differences, but the similarities from the Wehrmacht soldiers and today's armies are much bigger than we thought, because there is something like a general grammar of war. And this is, I think, the link, which we can really see in the book.
In Western culture, of course, the vets who are in their 80s and 90s today are considered the greatest generation. Yeah. In Germany, if you're in your 80s or 90s and you are known to have fought in this war, how does today's Germany regard you?
I mean, obviously not as a great generation, exactly as the opposite. And I think both interpretations are wrong. I mean, there is a national master narrative in Canada and United States and United Kingdom, which has this greatest generation attitude, and I think this is an idealism. And I mean, if you really have a close look on that, I mean, there are also war crimes, there are also atrocities, and people were just ordinary men fighting a war.
However, they defeated the most evil machine in the history of the world.
That's absolutely true, but you can question if the young soldiers had all this political attitude, which we now see nowadays. Sure. And it's exactly the same for the German side. Yes, they committed all these war crimes, but again, I think in terms of their worldview, there's somehow the similarities were much bigger than we thought. But you ask about the German attitude towards the war veterans. I mean, the German public is aware that there are so many war crimes committed by the Wehrmacht, and it's public knowledge. So the attitude towards the veterans, I think, is very critical.
Let me ask you one last thing, Sonke, and to that end, we're going to bring up a picture here, which you can see over my shoulder on the monitor. The Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, was in Greece recently, and she was greeted by thousands of angry demonstrators, some of them provoking her with Nazi flags and Nazi armbands. Most Germans, or many Germans, may oppose the bailout of Greece, but does being confronted by the swastika in a foreign land in 2012 still pose problems for Germany today?
Yes and no. I mean, I think Angela Merkel is a generation. She was not born in the war. She had nothing to do with that. So, and she's not a very emotional person, but she's a very rational person. So I think she's not affected very much by this. And obviously, man, it's a weird argument. You can't really compare Angela Merkel with Adolf Hitler, and I mean, you can't take these people serious. I mean, there's an explanation for that, and obviously, it's probably understandable that the Greek population suffered from the cuts, and all concentrate their anger on Angela Merkel and on Germany. But I mean, from a historical, from a scholar point of view, it's always obviously nonsense to do this. And I mean, I think it's fading away in the 70s. If you're traveling as a German to France, to Britain, the attitude was really much more different. And I think nowadays, when I'm living in London, I had never had a problem as a German there.
Do you think it angers Germans to see the swastika being brandished in a foreign land?
Yes, definitely, because when we know that Germany has drawn its conclusions, and they're very aware what happened in the Third Reich, and what else should we do, you could say.
The greatest thing you can say about Germany today is that it's a normal country,
yes,
right?
Hopefully, yeah, hopefully.
Sonke, it's awfully good of you to spare some time for us today. Soldaten, on fighting, killing, and dying, the secret World War II transcripts of German POWs. What a revelation. Sonke Neitzel, Dankeschön.
Thank you very much.
Wiedersehen.
Wiedersehen.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.